As Resby might say, it's just another Presbycast, just another hill to climb. Resby's traveling again. He hasn't left us. He hasn't resigned, but he's a busy man. He's a high roller these days, traveling here, there, and everywhere. All my texts with him are at airports, and pray for Resby as he travels around the country. But we're here, and we've got a topic that may seem broad and indefinite. Wouldn't be the first time, but I think you'll get where we're going, and hopefully we'll even go somewhere. And we're joined by, well, she's not supposed to say much, but we have a live Presby girl. Zoe's here, and we got Matt Adams, repeat guest member of the cast of Larger for Life, which we call Lulls for Life around here. We've got a mysterious guest from Michigan. He's partially disguised. We'll have to see if we can figure out who it is, wearing I don't know, it looks like something from the Middle East. And we've got his OPC brother, Tim Hopper, a deacon par excellence, mover and shaker in OPC deacondom. That's just all there. There's no other way to say it. That's just the way it is. But let's just go ahead and invite the senior member of our panel, Dr. Daryl Hart. I started to say minister at Hillsdale, but no, he's a professor at Hillsdale and a ruling elder in the OPC and all around troublemaker. So, what are you wearing there tonight, Doctor?
It's something I picked up in Turkey, actually. It's not, the keffiyeh is not something merely worn by Palestinians. Turks, Kurds, all sorts of people in the Middle East wear them. Although I guess the ones I've seen most on campuses of late are black and white and not blue. And I don't know what distinction there is, but I meant to use this as a gag the last time I was on because I tend to talk over people. So this could be the way of muzzling myself.
Yeah, and you may conflict with your microphone there too. So you're doing the to use the titles of Tom Wolfe books. You've got Radical Chic and you're Mowing the Flat Catchers.
But I want to be Man in Fall.
Well, who doesn't? Who doesn't? All these youngsters don't know anything about Tom Wolfe books.
Oh, that's such a shame.
But we do. We do. All right, so Dr. Hart's here, and let's just go counterclockwise. So we got Tim Hopper. Tim, you've been on a good while ago. You're out in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, and
that's right. I think it was before COVID I was on, so it was a different world.
Yep. Well, you were still tall even then. I want to know how tall you are because Matt Adams, who we'll introduce in a minute, he's 6'2", but you are what?
I'm 6'9" or 6'10" if you ask my mom.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
And a connoisseur of greasy spoon restaurants because we went to one once.
Yeah, we did. That one's gone downhill, sadly.
Yeah,
I went back and was really disappointed.
Is it a chain?
Oh, no, just a hole in the wall in Raleigh. Pickup trucks outside, but yeah.
The griddle is named after a famous cook who used to work there. It says, home of so-and-so's griddle. So it's good, or it was then.
Yeah.
All right. So Tim will bring a perspective on the OPC that even Dr. Hart can't bring because he's kind of a geek, which is a good thing for a deacon. He's got some figures and facts that we'll talk about later. And then Coach Matt Adams, we've dubbed him the coach. He's got his coaching hat on. He's going to call some ball plays tonight. But how are things in Greater Dillon, South Carolina?
The big city's doing well, Brad. I appreciate you asking. We're rocking and rolling all the time. All the time.
One of the notable things about your church is that it was formerly pastored by Dr. Doug Kelly, who most of us have heard of.
That's right. Yep. He was here in the 70s and early 80s, right before he went over to RTS Jackson. So we're his only pastorate. So anytime he tells a ministry story, it's about people in Dillon that I know of. I know them and their family and their children and everybody else. So small town living. So when he calls, the former secretary a servant of Satan, as he did at Twin Lakes Fellowship many years ago, I knew exactly who he was talking about, and he was not wrong.
Well, we're uncensored tonight. It's no editing. They're the unvarnished ecclesial truth up in this piece.
How
All
far
right.
is Dylan from Bucky's?
Oh man, we've got a Bucky's like 25 minutes from
Okay.
us, so it's too close to really stop at, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's cool to say that we have one right down the interstate from us.
I don't think Daryl's ever been to a Bucky's, but he got some treats from a Bucky's once.
Yes.
You can buy one of those scarves at Bucky's, actually.
Really?
It has a Bucky logo on it, but
Nothing says rebellion like the beaver. All right, so Zoe, you're with us just as kind of a backup, but we welcome your perspective and your concise comments, as long as they're duly respectful of all the men here.
Naturally, that's the point of my existence. You said Unvarnished is one of the brands, which is why I'm here too, just to make sure that nobody forgets that Unvarnished is the Presbycast vibe. So I'm happy to be providing the immaculate vibes here tonight. And Sarah Morris is going to make fun of me for using that word on the show later.
Well, we could say you're the unpolished one, but you no, that's wrong. You're quite polished. You're nearly a professional journalist. Broadcast journalist. So
Nearly.
Yeah,
I'm still working on that. When I'm famous, I won't forget you.
Good. Very good. Well, so 2024 is a weird time in the U.S. It's going to get weirder. Dr. Hart, as an observer of politics, you can probably vouch for the fact that we've sort of had a slow start. The crazy has not dialed up to the level I thought it would be yet. Is that your assessment?
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I guess because Trump is sort of confined in court, that might be one way of trying to explain it. But it does seem to be just kind of simmering before, I guess the debate might break it open, the first debate, which is remarkably early. But I mean, either way, I think what happens after the election will be, especially if Trump wins, it's going to be ugly. Doesn't mean that's what I hope will happen as far as the election goes, but I would like not to go back to 2017 in the way that the adults in the country were supposed to be the adults and didn't act that way. But
all right. So, but the strangest thing is, we in the PCA, we're, you might have heard of us. We're huge. We're 10 times the size of all these other little denominations. So we're very important. But we thought we were going to have a sleepy, quiet General Assembly. Everything seemed to be going well, people getting along. And then we're back into the realm of secular politics. And I want to hear everybody's thoughts on this, but yours, Dr. Hart. First of all, someone invited David French to an early morning, sure to be poorly attended, assembly-wide seminar, 8 a.m., probably would have had about 350 there, if that. And
that's poorly attended. 350.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because we got 2,000 people there.
Yeah, but still.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like four OPC churches.
Well.
Or more.
Well, maybe there's the same IQ, between a small OP church and 350 PCA people. I don't know. But it just blew everything wide open. And the internet melted down, and the far right got involved. And, here's a tip for people on the internet. If everybody is saying something negative about something, you really don't have to. It's really optional, and you don't have to. So we said very little about it. But I think I saw it 40 minutes after the tweet went out from the PCA magazine. and I could see it all. I could see the week laid out before me. I didn't like what I saw, but it became it got crazy. So, what was your reaction to that, Dr. Hart, as you're an American historian, not just a church historian?
Well, I mean, I'm almost as obsessed with David French as I was with Tim Keller. So you take what I say with several grains of salt. But
Stalker.
yeah, I just don't. I don't understand French's status. Why people view him the way they do. The people who regard him highly enough for him to land a perch at the New York Times. But I don't. I mean, it's hard for me to talk because I don't know how these seminars actually work at the PCA-GA. I mean, I have a sense. You know, I've listened or read some of the papers, like say when Lig Duncan and Tim Keller, or Brian Chappell before, et cetera, who gave talks at some of these seminars in the past. So I have a little bit of a sense of that. But since French is no longer in the communion, and I don't follow his wife really, but I've heard watching some of this play out that she's not said favorable things about the PCA. It's a very curious thing that he would still be on the radar enough of the people who invited him. And I in some ways I understand that, because maybe you want to have somebody influential speak at one of these things. And that will draw people, and that'll give you perhaps favorable press if David French writes a column about the PCA and what he saw there. Now, you know, it's also going to be curious what he writes now. I don't think he's going to be polite about it. He won't use any bad words, but
I don't think he'll say anything. I really don't. But I could be wrong about that. Time will tell.
Because Russell Moore will say it for him?
Yeah. I need to hear what Russell Moore thinks of the PCA. That's exactly what we need. So let me clarify for people that don't really know. It was a weird seminar. The seminar was how to support your pastor in a politically a year of political turmoil and stress. And at least one
polarization was the word they used, Brad.
Okay. Yeah. Well, polarization is stressful. We all know that. David Coffin was going to be on there. A couple of guys I'm not familiar with, but the other three were.
Paul McGildy, president of Grove City, right?
Oh, okay. I think you're right. Yeah. But they were all PCA, and David French was PCA, and it's not going to draw anybody new to the assembly because you've got to register, and the pool of attendees is fairly static. Not a lot of people get up at that hour for a seminar. So, but his disinvitation has caused about as much consternation as his invitation. And it wasn't that he was disinvited. It's just that the seminar was canceled after 3 or 4 days of twisting in the wind. And again, this decision was made either by one person or maybe just a small number. We didn't take a vote and said, let's have David French. It didn't seem like a good idea to hardly anyone, maybe except the people who invited him. And so I have a question, Dr. Hart. Who could be invited to the OPC General Assembly that would cause a similar level of consternation? And you could say David French, but you could say about anybody else if you want to.
That's a really good question. Tim, what do you think? I mean, as a deacon, maybe you don't go to many GAs, but
Charles Erdman's great-grandson.
Boy.
It's just hard to fathom even having a seminar like this at an OPCGA. So I think if someone was attending and not a speaker at a seminar, they'd be welcome with open arms whoever it was. But
I mean, back in the day, if you had a seminar on apologetics and you invited R.C. Sproul along with some Van Tillians, I could see that creating a ruckus. But maybe 30 years ago.
Okay, but what does an OPC ruckus look like, though? Just furrowed brows, or what would it be?
You would have some letters sent to the moderator, New Horizons, but it would be formal communications. And because it wasn't happening, I mean, in our case, it wouldn't happen during the General Assembly because we don't have any time for that while the Assembly meets. So if it were before the Assembly, there wouldn't be any way of sort of having a protest. I mean, I guess somebody could write a protest once the Assembly convenes, but that would be the other mechanism to object.
So you all don't broadcast your assembly around the world. Like, we've got our own satellite. Few people know that, but we've got our own, satellite in geosynchronous orbit just for the PCA to beam the General Assembly all over the world.
Is that true?
No.
Okay. I mean, maybe.
I was about to say.
I mean, the PCA is so impressive, and your ties with Elon Musk are so strong that maybe that.
Yeah, Skynet. Our website's called PCA Net because
Right.
there's so many PCAs, including the Porsche Club of America. That's easy to find if you search for the PCA. So we're PCAnet.net or something. It's not a great handle web address. Matt, I'm not going to bash David French because it's been done. And I know some people like him. There's a pretty, people are not, they're not on the fence about David French usually. What was your reaction to the whole thing and the reaction to the reaction?
Well, I think the first thing is, already been said, but we're sitting in an assembly room with 2/3 of us are ministers, and we're going to have someone lecture us on how to lecture our members, I guess, on how to encourage us. It seemed very strange.
Well, it's kind of meta. It's meta. That's how you should describe it.
Well, it felt like one of those college safe spaces. You are good. You are a blessing to your church. This is a polarizing year, and you are helpful, and you are loved. And I mean, that's what it felt like to me.
And doggone it, people like you.
Doggone it, people like me. And there might, speaking of dogs, some of these safe spaces even have puppies that you can pet. I heard that was going on at the Citadel, the military school of South Carolina.
Hold on.
They bring in these dogs during finals week that you can
Resby
pet.
had this idea. Resby had this idea of confining all the teaching elders behind in a lucite cube, kind of a cage, and we could put the puppies in there.
That's right.
Because they need it.
Yeah, they might need it. But the even in little old Dillon, the reactions were not. It wasn't well received by our officers and even by some of our members. I fielded dozens of questions that next Lord's Day.
Hold on, you're at a fairly small church in a fairly small town, not in a cosmopolitan place, and you got lots of reaction to this.
Lots, yes.
Wow.
Yep. So because of much of the troubling, unbiblical positions that David French is publicly taking with some of the critical theory and agendas that have been prominent throughout our American culture now. And I think that, some of the responses have just elevated those things because, we've been told on social media that those who had issues with it have essentially violated the 9th commandment against French when we're just sharing articles that he has published with these positions that he's taken. So it wasn't a wise move on any part. And that was the feeling that I got from even, my 130, 125 regular attenders on the Lord's Day.
Zoe is from whatever generation you are. It's one of those high, late in the alphabet letters. Quickly, what did you make of the whole? The French fiasco.
Well,
The French disconnection. That's what we could call it.
The French mistake, as somebody put it earlier in the day to me. Matt already brought out the fact that it's kind of weird to have a panel talking about how to support your pastor that's going out to pastors. Just very odd in the first place. I think it was probably a good idea to cancel the panel. I think it was replaced with a time of prayer for our country, which you can always use more of that. But yeah, I think the biggest deal about the panel was its existence. One thing that kind of boggles my mind is that pastors, depending on where you're ministering, and depending on what difference you have between, like, politically between yourself and the congregation, churches are at least one place, at least the local church, where you probably should avoid talking about politics at all costs. Not, for any sort of cowardice, but just...
You mean partisan politics?
Partisan politics, yes. Not
every issue that might be, that might touch on politics or that politics might have something to do with.
Yes, that's a great clarification. But I think this whole debacle is necessary just so that the PCA has its periodical yearly humbling period, lest we think that we've fixed all of our problems. So probably good idea to cancel, in my opinion. I thought about it a lot. I was speaking with a few of my Southern Baptist friends who were watching the debacle, and they were actually looking favorably on the cancellation. Not that that means much, but it was interesting to see how everybody on the internet seemed to have an opinion about this. And Matt already talked about the whole Ninth Commandment accusation with posting David French's articles. So yeah, that was a fun time. I'm looking forward to seeing David French be referenced in certain floor speeches.
Yeah, and people used it to, the PCA was condemned as already gone liberal. The evidence just being that this was ever even contemplated, this invitation. That's ridiculous and insane. People condemning David French as not a Christian, which I think is also insane and unnecessary. But it became the Moscow and nationalist crowd used it as for 2 or 3 days of clicks, and that was unhelpful. So that's and then it became a litmus test, a virtue signaling device on both sides. And it became tiresome very quickly.
Can I ask?
I agree with
yes.
Of the PCA folks here, I mean, to me, again, because I'm obsessed with French and used to be obsessed with Keller, but if Tim Keller were still alive, would the PCA have needed to invite French? Would Keller have been the person to be there instead of French? So is this an indication that there's a kind of Keller deficit? You get somebody like that to make up for it. And also, though, what also strikes me as odd, no offense to the other people that were going to be on the panel, but nobody else seemed to be of the stature that French is. And if Keller were alive, he would be of a stature to be there with French, and then you could have some other regular PCA people, perhaps. So I wonder how much this kind of reflects the ripple still of Keller's influence and a desire among some to have that kind of voice, that voice being lacking, and this is what happens.
Yeah, I'm going to say it wouldn't make any difference because I don't know if Matt's followed it, but my impression was that Keller would show up at a PCA General Assembly about every 4 years. I think, I've been to probably 5 or 6, and I think he's been at one of those. So
wasn't the last one that he attended Greensboro when his wife was given the report? I think that's right.
Probably so, yeah. but I didn't see him there. I was only there for one evening. I wasn't there the whole thing for the whole time. He was there in Nashville in 2010, but in the last 4, I don't believe he's been there. Not
But,
as far as
you know, Brad, I think that Dr. Hart brings up a really good point, though, because even in some of the, the online communications that were going back and forth on X, formerly known as Twitter, and some of the communications that we've, read, it talked about this kind of the third way, and that was often reference for Keller. It was
Right.
this third way of thinking about our culture. It was the third way of thinking about evangelism or church planting or whatever it might be. But it was this middle way. And in reference to French, they were thinking that he was going to present something of this middle or third way on this panel, so that's an interesting point that you made. I just put that together in my mind.
For a lot of people, they're contemporaries. So yeah, I can see what Matt's saying. Of course, now we'll never know, but I can imagine that happening, even though Keller doesn't seem to have had that much invested in General Assemblies. But as far as political contemporaries, he seems to have been somewhat in the same group. So,
well, you'll remember this, Brad and Zoe. I'm pretty sure you were there last year at GA2. We summoned upon the former the founders of the denomination to see who they would vote for moderator. So maybe
because we can definitely tell that.
Summon Tim Keller back and see what he would think about the French invitation.
All right. Well, we didn't plan to talk about this, but we did. It's natural that we would. I did want to ask who would the OPC's David French invitee be, and it was very boring, which is what I was expecting. Something about apologetics, so it puts me right to sleep. But we do love a time capsule on Presbycast, and Dr. Hart is well able to analyze things like that. And I don't know if he saw this Substack that I put up earlier. Let me get the banner off the screen so we can see Dr. Hart. But, it's one of these things. I asked the historian of the PCA who posted this on a closed Facebook group if I could use it. But then I thought, well, I really need to use it, so I just went ahead and used it without permission. So I'll take the post down if he doesn't want me to use it, but we're going to use it tonight. The PCA Historical Center is really impressive, and Wayne Sparkman is a fine man and a fine historian and a fine denominational treasure, really. And,
Here.
And he posted an excerpt from a history of a little church, well, not that little, it's a mid-sized church in Mississippi. And apparently what happened is they were in PCUS. They were all from one or maybe 2 or 3 PCUS churches. And as the reunion of the Northern and Southern Church, that being the UPC USA and the PCUS becoming the second PCUSA without parentheses in 1983, it's just, I have footnotes, it's just that exciting and clear. And you all know it's true. But this church, they just petitioned to form a church. So they left a PCUS church in, I think it's Pontotoc, Mississippi, and started a PCA church, which met, temporary facilities. And then eventually they built a building in the last 10, 20 years. Very nice building I saw. So I think they're a thriving smaller church, unlike some small churches in Mississippi. Some of them are very, 10, 12 members, but not this church. So they've been a successful church. And their historian, who happened to be a lady, wrote up the reasons for why they left the PCUS and formed a PCA church. They didn't buy their way out. They just started from scratch with nothing. So it says in 1983 they petitioned Covenant Presbytery to be a church, and that's when they were formed. And Dr. Hart may have never seen this. Coming on the screen now is a button from the 1983 Joint Assembly that was campaigning. It says, "If you're for reunion, smile," with a yellow smiley. Have you ever seen that, Dr. Hart?
If not,
I took that from the PCUSA historical site and probably violating copyright, and I don't care because they owe us justice for Machen, as we all know,
wow.
and so it's fine. So this historical article that was written probably in the 80s, and it's entitled, Wayne entitled it, "Why Churches Left the Old PCUS." So this is 1983, happens to be the year I graduated from high school, so it doesn't seem that long ago to me. But there's a summary of why this church left the PCA. And there's nothing analogous about the state of the PCA and the PCUS. I say over and over again, to the delight of some and the chagrin of others, that there are no theological liberals in the PCA. As Dr. Hart knows, as the historian of Machen, there's a precise definition of theological liberal. And there aren't even that many of pure ones in the PC USA these days. They're mostly Bardians, although some are further out than even the liberals of Machen's days were. But we don't throw around the word theological liberal recklessly because it's just not a good idea. Or do you agree with that, Dr. Hart? I mean,
Yes.
yes, it's not helpful to call somebody who's a little off in one way a Protestant liberal. But they gave reasons, and I think there's about 7 of them for why they left the PCUS. And this is somewhat reminiscent, and I don't think the source is, but Morton Smith's famous book, "How the Gold Has Become Dim," which basically from General Assembly minutes of the PCUS recounted all the actions of the church, which he considered to be evidence of decline and declension and deformation, as opposed to reformation. So let's run some of these through these quickly, and we'll see if there are any parallels to today in our churches. And what I want us to think about is slippery slopes and people who raise red flags and people who say, "Hey, look, that indicates we may be going the wrong way." That person is never popular. We've all seen Lord of the Rings. Gandalf Stormcrow was not a popular guy because he always had bad news, but doggone it, he was right. So let's travel back 40 years or more to see what was going on and why a church would leave a denomination. One of the first ones that's called they mentioned the Castleman case. Someone from Union Presbytery, the PCUS, accepted a man as a minister when he denied that Christ was God. In 1961, a PCUS minister denied the virgin birth of Christ, the bodily resurrection, and the second coming. And there's more instances of people denying these cardinal doctrines. In my own town, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where my church is, our former PCUS church doubled in size at some point in the 60s because there was actually a northern church in the South, and it was because all these, I'm going to use a swear word, all these Yankees came to Oak Ridge, Tennessee to help build the bomb in the 40s. And
Wait, I thought they were Jews.
No, well, we probably had some. They weren't. We didn't outlaw them or anything. But a group of women who had come down with their husbands, mostly from the North or from other parts of the U.S., who were PCUSA ladies, they said, "We don't want to go to no Southern church," and they petitioned. So maybe one of the first, I don't know how many PCUSA churches there were in the South in 1945 or 6, but we had one. And I think in the early 60s, maybe even the late 50s, they called a pastor who promptly announced that he didn't believe in the miracles, the virgin birth, the resurrection, or anything. So I always like to say the Christians in that church came and joined the church that my church that didn't join the PCA, like this church, until 1983. So that's not happening in the PCA. It's not happening in the OPC or anywhere else in NAPARC, as far as we know. So the second point, after the standard deity of Christ, resurrection, miracles, declension, has to do with the inerrancy of Scripture. Everyone in every NAPARC church, I assume, still affirms the inerrancy of Scripture. Now, our arguments sometimes touch on the sufficiency of Scripture, but I don't think we have a lot of Bible doubters in the PCA or in any other NAPARC denomination. I don't even think I have to ask if everyone agrees with that. I think we believe that's the case. But then we get into politics, which, as you know, the David French thing touched on things political, and political stressors were at work. So let me read this short paragraph. The PCUS, that's the old Southern Church that became, some of their churches left to become the PCA. They began getting into politics as early as 1961 when the adult uniform lessons advocated, get this, one world government, unilateral disarmament, and surrender of United States sovereignty. Well, that sounds familiar. And this is the Southern Church, the PCUS. In 1966, the GA endorsed civil disobedience. In 68, the Assembly called for gun control. That would not go over well in the PCA. The 1969 Assembly favored selective service, conscientious objection. The 77 Assembly called for get this, now we're way ahead of our time, guaranteed income, UBI, welfare reforms to include the requirement that work is not necessary. Dr. Hart, did you know all that stuff was being advocated by the Southern Church that far back?
I recall hearing that argument, although I don't recall, all those specific points. And you know, the question is always going to be from the other side, well, you're interpreting these statements this way, but did we really say those things? But still, the larger point I think probably stands is that the church was beginning to engage in political advocacy of some kind.
Now, someone might say, well, those are political things, and the important thing is the church and the doctrine and the gospel. So just kind of don't worry about that, which is what some people would have implied with David French. Well, that's political. We ought to be able to deal with that and turn a blind eye and just kind of absorb that and move on. But, you know, you're a professor and an international historian. You've used the word clubbable before. You know, you've got to kind of get along in the university setting. You kind of got to be open-minded. It's part of the job. But most church members don't swim in a sea of nuance.
Right.
And they don't. So that's the reason. As soon as I heard about the David French thing, I texted someone who I thought would have some influence, and I said, "This is just not a good idea. It's going to cause a lot of stress." And I predicted how people would react, and that's what they did, because anybody could see it. But we can't expect all of our fellow church members to take a nuanced, balanced, considered view of everything. They've got other things to think about and other things to do. So let's talk about that. Even while we may owe indulgence to our fellow church members who have weird, wacky, maybe even, left of center political views, people should also extend some grace to those who are just they're culturally and religiously conservative, and whether those things have to go together and always go together. And if someone thinks they're equal to one another, that's obviously a problem. But I'd like to hear from Matt too. Shouldn't there be some grace for just Joe Pewsitter, who maybe, bless his heart, he watches Fox News and he believes it all? Of course he's going to react that way, and we shouldn't judge him more harshly than we judge a leftist. So, any thoughts on that, Doctor?
Oh, I thought, Matt, you going to go?
No, go ahead, Dr. Hart. I'll add to what you say, or subtract from it, probably.
Well, I mean, it seems too simple, but the way out of this is just for the church not to make any statements about politics, whether from Fox News or MSNBC, and that way that the ordinary Joe in the pew, as well as the elder who may be a professor at a college, who may be more, toward the center, if not left of center politically, there's nothing going to be agitating them coming from the pulpit or the session, because the session isn't making any declarations, Presbytery or General Assembly. I mean, that, and you could say, well, if they're not preaching the whole counsel of God, that's a problem, and that is a problem. But the point of the spirituality of the church is usually that the Bible doesn't talk about guns. It doesn't talk about selective service. It doesn't talk about guaranteed income. In fact, in some ways it does. But so it's just that the church doesn't need to take a stand on any of this stuff. But, there's an urge among people to sound relevant, to sound like they care about these concerns. And invariably, it seems to me that's why churches or officers or other people begin to speak about these matters, especially in the name of Christ, to say, no, Christ is on the right side of this issue.
So you refer to the spirituality of the church. We had T. David Gordon on to talk about that a few weeks ago, and he made some people mad.
Really?
Yeah. And
That's too bad.
well, he was against our humble petition on principle.
Right.
I think I was initially against it, but then I became for it, and I'm sure Matt's probably for it. Matt's a spirituality of the church guy, but he's probably got there is a type of Southern spirituality of the church that is a little more culturalist. But what do you say, Matt?
No, I mean, I would, to show my cards, I was for the humble petition. But while Dr. Hart was talking, I was thinking about just the simple fact. I've been teaching through the Sermon on the Mount at our prayer meeting here recently, and constantly, we remind our congregations that our citizenship is in the kingdom of Christ first and foremost. It is superior to our citizenship of America, South Carolina, Dillon, wherever it might be. And then, so when we bring politics, specifically, someone as polarizing as somebody like David French, into the courts of the church, it comes across in a lot of ways as hypocrisy. While I think that there is a need pastorally to be aware of the polarization of this year's election and the debates that are soon to happen, and as Dr. Hart was talking about, adults acting like children in Congress and on C-SPAN, and a lot of people even moving from something like Fox News to Newsmax. Why we need to be aware of those things. Our duty is to preach Christ and to remind our people that we're sojourners in this land that is full of sin and dealing with the consequences of sin, and so when we think that someone needs to come in that is in the political arena to help us to consider these things, not only is it seemingly hypocrisy to many of the people in the pews. It just feels very tone deaf. And I mean, you brought it up, Brad. So I was getting the questions, from the average pew sitter: has the PCA gone liberal? My first General Assembly was Greensboro, where we failed to constitutionalize that marriage is between one man and one woman. I know that we ended up doing that. The next General Assembly, I think that was in Atlanta. But you begin to, these things, especially something like, marriage, these things begin to sit in people's minds. And then you have someone as controversial as French, and automatically they believe that we make the easy jump to denying the virgin birth, or at least having that within our courts. And so, while I know that we don't have any theological liberals in the PCA, when we begin to sit here and have people who are, left of center in a lot of ways politically, for the average pew sitter, I guess in Southern Bible Belt America, it's not a far-fetched jump for them to make. And so, while, we've said that until we're blue in the face, there are no theological liberals in the PCA. That I even think that is, for the average pew sitter, that's often met with suspicion and doubt, because of some of the cultural movements that we've seen.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that at all. It's definitely the case that, and we need to be sensitive to that. That you've got to be pastoral as you bring these things in, and the spirituality of the church does protect you from thinking you have to comment on everything. The PCA, the PCUSA, and the PCUS, they were, about once a month, they were putting out a position paper on every social issue in the 60s, and that wears thin pretty quickly. All right, well,
Brad,
yes.
Well, I was just going to say, the guys who are serving alongside of me on the session in Dillon were deacons, or training to be deacons, or coming home from college when we left the PCUS and came into the PCA. And I'll never forget the first year that I brought a ruling elder was the first year that a ruling elder had been at a General Assembly in a long time, and a fellow presbyter in our presbytery, PD presbytery, asked him how he thought it was going, and he said, this is deja vu for me. It seems as if some of the conversations that were happening were in the early stages of the slide into liberalism for the PCUS that we were so aware of. We just lost in the past, year or two, the last ruling elder who was sitting on the session when we came into the PCA. And I remember him talking about these very same points that are in this article. One point that he brought up particularly was that the denominational Sunday school curriculum was explaining away Christ walking on water, how he did that. And he remembers these things. These elders that I'm serving along with, they remember these things, and so for them, when we're having these, cultural conversations with kind of a left-centered mentality being shown on the floor of General Assembly, it is like deja vu. They feel as if, we are on the slippery slope. I know we're going to get there, but I also think that's why, good guardrails are so helpful in this time for our denomination.
Yeah, we'll talk about a couple of those legislatively in a minute. Now we're getting into a couple of things that are, there is a moral dimension to politics, and there are some political issues that have clear moral dimensions that the Bible does speak to. So point 4 in this reasons this church, way back in 1983, joined the PCA, was that the in 1964, the PCUS, the Old Southern Church, and seems early. By 1971, they had a fund that was paying for abortions for poor women. That's a moral issue. That's not a political issue, although it's been made political. And so they spent quite a bit of money on that. And then in 1972, they were giving money to guerrilla groups in South Africa and supporting guerrillas in Rhodesia. I think I could figure out a way that might violate some commandments of some sort. You can imagine how some people might get a little prickly about that. I mean, the people in the PCUS, they were all Southerners, okay? Southerners then were, I mean, it wouldn't fly now. It didn't fly then. And that's pretty egregious. And as Johnny Carson would say, wild, wacky stuff. And then we get into of course, everyone's favorite issue in the church, sex. In 1964.5, premarital sex was was spoken of approvingly by a conference speaker at a denomination youth conference. In 1972, the General Assembly refused to call homosexual behavior a sin. This was restated in 1980. In 1977, now, Dr. Hart, if you think back to recent PCA history, you might know what I'm thinking of when I read this one. In 1977, a homosexuality paper was sent to presbyteries, refusing again to call homosexuality a sin, saying that it only, quote, falls short of God's plan. We've heard things like that in the past 10 years by people who were actually not in favor of homosexuality, but because of their missional, outward-facing posture, contextualization. And that's the reason, as Matt mentioned, that we had we didn't approve saying that marriage was between one man and one woman in our book of worship in 2017, and we had to fight hard to get it in 2018 because of contextualization and outward-facing missionalism. Because we have a significant number of churches in cities, and guess who lives in cities? It's not Ozzie and Harriet, apparently. So now we're getting into issues that have rolled the PCA, from 2018 to, let's say, 2021. I think we're past that. But we had an issue with homosexuality of sorts. And this sounds very, very familiar. And then they quote, now remember, this church did not join the PCA in 73. They didn't join until 83, so they lived through a decade of declension in the PCUS that the founding churches did not. So in 1980, they mentioned that the minutes of General Assembly included a statement that said sex outside of marriage can be the work of God.
Wow.
That's, whether, I assume this is accurate. That's pretty rough. And then something that's really gonna be familiar to you. There was actually another COCU in 1966, consultation on church union, ecumenical issues, the issues that radicalized Machen at the 20 General Assembly, his first.
Right.
And there was another COCU, right? That one of the, I think when they were trying to do organic union, the Seven Sisters of the Main Line back in the 20s or 30s, I think they called it the same way, same thing. And so very unwise ecumenism, church union, that was also something the PCUS was pursuing.
My great grandfather was a PCOS missionary, and he had been ordained 50 years in 1966, and he wrote an article called "The Great Apostasy." Actually, it was a sermon. I have the text of it on my website, but he said that the the PCOS's participation in the COCU in '66 was the great apostasy of the PCOS, and he later joined the PCA at the very end of his life.
Well, there you go. That's a real connection to history. Now, you've got a couple of websites. Are we talking readmachin.com or are we talking another one?
No, this is my allstarworldly.com is my Presbyterian history notes, basically, that a lot of family history on there.
Ulster, as in Northern Ireland, allstarworldly.com. You can find that. Yeah. Lots of good sort of primary source stuff there that you can take a look at. And then, the church union thing, the OPC was formed in 36, and they did pursue some church union talks, but they certainly weren't talking about joining back with the mainline church in 1966 the way the PCUS was. So ecumenism is an issue. It was an issue for me. My first General Assembly in 2010, there was a strategic plan, which is a very corporate sounding thing. And one of the things that, threw out there in an early draft was, we'll just leave NAPARC and we'll join up with people that we have more in common with. And I thought, I don't want to merge with the EPC. I want to stay in league with the OPC and all the weirdos in NAPARC. So that's one of the reasons. That's one of the things that got me to General Assembly in 2010. It was an ecumenical issue. So any comments on ecumenism or church union, Doctor?
Not particularly. It's curious the way church cooperation just doesn't go away throughout the 20th century, and it takes these different forms, and yet the denominations themselves are very reluctant to give up their own autonomy as well. So the Federal Council of Churches, which was the first of these in 1908, was a federalist way to do it. Okay, we're going to cooperate on some things the way the states were supposed to, and the denominations will have their own sovereignty the way the states were supposed to. But then by the 1951, it's National Council of Churches minus 1920, which failed, which was the plan for organic union. But then COCU comes, as you were saying, Chortles, as a kind of redo of 1920. And it's just, I don't know. A lot of it's built up around social, moral, political leaning matters.
You mean Christian nationalism? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, although they wouldn't call it that.
Yeah, I know.
And there is a kind of Christian globalism dimension to it as well. I mean, that this is going to be something on the mission field that's going to be exported to other cultures and societies. But to go back to the first 2 points of this, when it comes to the doctrinal pieces, whether inerrancy or the miraculous supernatural aspects of Christ's own ministry and work, I was thinking when you were going through this that the points 1 and 2 are very much about an older, and this is what Machen was writing about, particularly in Christianity liberalism, was that science had made it very difficult to hold on to the supernatural aspects of either Christ's work or the Bible. That, the Bible is really just like a lot of other ancient literature. And of course, Jesus was extraordinary in some ways, a great teacher, but couldn't be that he was virgin born. He couldn't be that he rose from the dead, because science tells us otherwise. But then you come to the other parts, and those don't really have much to do with science as they have to do with, say, justice or politics. But in our time, it would be justice. And so I'm sitting here trying to think about what's the relationship between the two, because these days, and I think one of the reasons why there's no liberalism in the PCA the way there was, at least in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the PCUS and PCUSA was that back then science really mattered a lot. Of course, we heard a lot about science during the pandemic, but people aren't following science. It's not perhaps as novel now as it was then. So the idea that you need to trim your sails in the church according to what science is saying is not as much of an influence. But if the church needs to trim its sails according to what justice demands, of course, then that becomes, I think that is a way in which a kind of liberalism can emerge. And it's not as if that wasn't the case going on 100 years ago, because the social gospel was clearly present as well. And I guess I'm struggling to try to figure out which was more important. I guess I'm thinking back then science was more important, with justice in the background, justice fueling the social gospel. But these days, it seems justice is more important than science. And could it conceivably result? Would justice lead people to deny the virgin birth or the inerrancy of Scripture?
Well, I think it can certainly hurt the doctrine of the atonement. That's been predicted. I think as you become more egalitarian, which we may talk about a little bit, you've got to deny or seriously reinterpret certain passages to justify, for justice reasons, and we've seen this, female pastors, female elders. We could talk about the many PCA ministers more so than churches who have moved left into the EPC, ECO, even the PCUSA, the Anglican Church, all of which are far more egalitarian. And we know that, intersectionality connects all of that stuff. Feminism, racism, everything, and certainly sexual minorities, so-called. That's all connected. So I think John Payne's made this point that, and even the late Harry Reeder said they tried to make a connection between progressivism and liberalism, that they're two versions of the same thing. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but there's certainly connections, and I certainly understand where they're coming from. Let me hit the last two here, and then we'll move on to some good news. But the last point for why this old church left the PCUS, let's see. They said there are other objections which prompted our withdrawal from the PCUS, but to name just a few, the 74 Assembly refused to say that men are lost apart from God. So so either, I don't know whether you're denying, if you're becoming universalistic, you're denying original sin, or you're denying the exclusivity of Christ. I don't know exactly what cast that had on it, but no bueno. The 75 Minutes included a paper which denied there was a personal devil. Very popular. And now this was a shocker to me. The 1980 Assembly gave toddlers the right to take communion. We still have a little bit of pedo communion of sorts in the PCA, and we certainly have what's called young child communion, which is sort of a custom of sort of fairly automatically receiving 4 and 5-year-olds to church membership and letting them have the supper. So here we have, a resonance, a rhyming with something that was going on in the main line, the old Southern Church, back in the 80s. So that was sort of a surprising thing. Intinction is around a bit, and there's some other. We have PCA churches that love to immerse people, which is it's not the worst thing that ever happened, but I think that's a problem. So we always have people pushing the edges on sacraments. So there you go. There are a few hints of similarity between the 60s and 70s and today. But again, we are in a different we're in a different place. So I alluded to the fact that there are PCA ministers leaving. Generally, our leftmost fringe tends to leave. They're not staying around, and a not insignificant number of ministers and a few churches have left the denomination. Almost all of them seem to have conversions to egalitarian views right before they left, because they wouldn't admit them a year before, but all of a sudden they're egalitarians. Women can be elders, women can be pastors or preach, and they're gone. So we're pushing on those issues a bit. We should ratify an amendment to the Constitution of the PCA this year that would clamp down on the use of titles. In other words, you can't be called an elder or a pastor or a minister if you're not qualified and ordained. We think that's going to pass. I don't think it would touch the deacon-deaconess issue. I don't think it would touch the deaconess issue, but certainly calling an unordained person, male or female, a deacon would be problematic according to the language of this new provision. And we have the opportunity, and I think Matt Adams is connected to the genesis of this overture, to constitutionalize a section of our directory for worship about what preaching is and who should do it. So, Matt, can you comment on that very briefly from a PCA perspective?
Yeah, so, I guess in a lot of ways, Brad, our overture from PD Presbytery, for all of our PCA listeners, is overture 3.
Oh, let me jump in. PD is the name of a river. It's not.
It's the name of the river.
You weren't trying to be
river
goofy.
System, actually.
And
yeah,
so
it's PEEDEE. Yeah,
and the Warrior Presbytery is not named after Machen's children. It's named after a river again. So we name things after rivers in the South. Sorry.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, we redeemed the old PCUS Presbytery name. So we were PD Presbytery when First Pres Dillon left the PCUS and went to the PCA. And then when we multiplied Palmetto Presbytery into 3 new presbyteries, we decided as a presbytery to reclaim that name from the old denomination. So I'm pretty pumped about the name, even though many people don't understand what is named after. But nonetheless, so we're putting up an overture this year that would piggyback off of the titles, I think, in a lot of ways. And it is reactionary. Admittedly, that would constitutionalize our chapter in the Book of Church Order, specifically the Directory of Worship, on preaching, which explains what preaching is for the PCA understanding of it. But it lends an amendment or proposes an amendment that would change the language of some other person to a qualified man or a qualified male. And it's really just to set some guardrails. Actually, we're not narrowing our understanding historically in the PCA of who can preach, but it would just put up some stronger guardrails on it is men who are qualified that should be ascending into the pulpit to handle God's word on the Lord's Day. And so
it's good to have guardrails when there's a slippery slope on the edge of the road.
Right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. I remember Rick Phillips years ago at a prayer meeting at General Assembly telling the group there that was gathered, if the cultural winds are blowing against us, let us treat our BCO as a tent and let's nail down another peg. And I think that's a wise word for us.
Well, Matt, you know why
egalitarianism is blowing against us.
You know why we need a big tent, don't you?
Well,
we got to have somewhere to keep all the clowns.
Well, yes. maybe the tent's getting a little smaller. But yeah, so I think I know that a lot of the pushback against our overture has been in regards to this idea of having a constitutionalized directory of worship, even though, to my understanding, we're the only NAPARC denomination that does not have one. A lot of people want to push back against the idea of having a constitutionalized directory of worship.
Yeah, it's create your own adventure. It's build
Yeah.
a bear in the PCA.
Yeah, yes. But constitutionalizing a chapter on preaching, on rightly handling the word of God, in my mind, it should not be that controversial. We are a denomination that believes, as the Catechism says, that it is especially through the preaching of the word that God draws sinners to salvation. And so we have the ordinary means, word, sacrament, and prayer. And I could die peacefully if we could constitutionalize just those 3 chapters. What is prayer? How do we do prayer? What are the sacraments? How do we do sacraments? What is preaching? How do we do preaching?
Yeah, and the preaching chapter is a good one, and
it's very good.
There are some you might want to change, but there's nothing that needs to be changed in that one, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
I mean, there's a couple of occasions where some antiquated language is used, but overall, it's one of those chapters that is just so helpful. I think to just the practical ministry of the word in the local church.
So you alluded to the ordinary means of grace, which actually we need to segue to the to our last sort of segment here, and that is literally some good news about the growth of ordinary means of grace churches. Now, ordinary means of grace churches, we might call them confessional churches, churches that that rely on, they usually have 2 worship services on the Lord's Day. They have a simple ministry. They have what we might call traditional or simple worship. And a funny thing has happened since 2020, and that's what we want to talk about now. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was prophetic about something, tongue in cheek. I haven't gone back to find it, but in an early podcast right after COVID hit, Resby and I were talking, and we said, it hit us. We said, a lot of people are going to, when these mega churches and a lot of these churches, evangelical churches, shut down, there's just a percentage of people that are never coming back. And that happened. A lot of churches haven't rebounded. A lot of people lost 20% and never got them back. That hasn't happened in NAPARC generally, and especially, as far as I know, and I've heard it anecdotally again and again. I know Matt can back this up, and we may talk a little bit about the PCA perspective. But our friend Tim, who thankfully he's a deacon geek, that's not an uncommon species. He's got data, and in his presbytery, an amazing thing has happened since 2020. And Tim, tell us about it. And I don't know if this is that way in the Upper Midwest. Daryl, you can chime in if we have time. Zoe can tell us about her church. Her husband, the church plant that her husband pastors. It's growing. I mean, it's growing noticeably and significantly. And Tim, tell us about the boring, old, colorless, mean OPC churches in your presbytery and how they ran everybody off and nearly they all went out of business after COVID. That's what happened, right?
Yeah. So I'm in the presbytery of the southeast of the OPC, which I think is currently the biggest presbytery with about around 30 churches and church plants. And I tweeted something a while back about the growth that our church has seen over the last 3 or 4 years. We just planted a church in about a year ago because we were literally running out of space in our church building. But we've seen a lot of growth. One, we just happen to be in an area where a lot of people are moving out of places like Michigan, and so there people just show up regularly that are coming from Reformed churches and moving down here looking for a Reformed church. But I think one of the remarkable things that we've seen, and from I've talked with others in our presbytery, it's just a lot of young people who are believers often who are just tired of things going on in other churches. They're tired of just the shows, the music that just becomes a performance. And I think there was some amount with the whole response that some churches had to the George Floyd death in 2020, as well as churches' responses to COVID. I mean, we even meeting outside morning and evening for a while. Our church was growing. We were meeting outside because we were meeting and we were worshiping. So interestingly, I mean, and this is all public information in the OPCGA Minutes website, but I just pulled it up today to look at the demographics in our presbytery over the last 3 years, and looking at numbers from January 2020 until December 2022. And in our presbytery of almost 30 congregations, one dissolved and then one shrunk slightly, and every other church either stayed steady or grew in communicant members. And as a whole, our presbytery has grown by 20% in communicant members, which is outpacing.
20% is a lot. Okay,
it is a lot. Yeah,
that's a lot,
and it's outpacing the OPC, which has not, as Daryl could tell us, never seen dramatic growth. It looks like in recent years we've kind of stayed on par with the growth of the country as a whole, which is not significant. But yeah, we've also seen 28% in non-communicant members, 28% growth, which I contributed 2 new souls to that over the last 3 years. So I'll pat myself on the back for that one. But I think really the remarkable thing to me is the young people. And I'm saying as someone who's coming close to 40, these are the people in their 20s, often young couples, young families, are really just looking for fellowship and reverent worship and faithful preaching. And they're tired of the dog and pony show, as my former pastor called what you find in many churches. So it's been neat to see. And I'm hearing the same story from other congregations in our presbytery.
Yeah, and we've seen it. Our church has grown. We planted a church. We have it's still fairly small. But we started in the middle of COVID, so it's going to slow it down a bit. Matt's church supports our church's church plant, which is cool. We're connected, and we recently had to replace our chairs in our building, and we reconfigured them to get 35 more chairs on the floor, and because we needed it. Because the consultants will tell you if you're 70% full, you're full, and you won't get any new people because people walk in and they don't see enough empty seats and they turn around and walk out. So it's been noticeable. It's been helpful having 35 more chairs. We have like a lot of OPC churches. The families that come to our church sometimes have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids, and you got to put them somewhere. So you got to have some empty seats. Matt, have you seen? I mean, most of our friends in the PCA, their churches have grown. Sometimes dramatically, sometimes just, but at a pretty nice clip. But what are you seeing and hearing? And again, some people are moving to the South. They're leaving California. They're leaving, but the places they're coming from are not real churchy areas either. So I don't think that accounts for all of it. But what do you see from the metropolis of Dillon?
No, one of the things that we were observing when we were turning in our church statistics this past year was since 2020, we have grown more in communing members and non-communing members than we had the previous 2 decades. We've brought in more members since 2020 and non-communing members, covenant children, sent for 20 years before 2020. And like Tim said, it has predominantly been younger families with children who are looking for just not only a system of doctrine that is rooted in history, but a simple ministry, a simple worship style, real preaching. That's a big point of the new members that we have. Not this shallow feel good preaching, but really delving in and contemplating what the Word of God says. And one of the things that I've told a number of people is, I think that at least in small town America, we have seen that since 2020, nominal Christianity has decreased tremendously, and real authentic Christianity has increased. And so the people who are coming are committed to the local church, committed to the worship of God, and committed to a desire for real discipleship and community. We even have families who are driving from bigger cities, much bigger cities like Florence, South Carolina, or Lumberton, North Carolina, driving into Dillon. Yeah, Florence isn't as a Charlotte or a Columbia or Greenville, but a comparison to Dillon is big.
Yeah, Lumberton is the Paris of the Southeast, definitely.
Yeah. But we have people, we have young families driving 30, 35, 40 minutes to get to First Pres Dillon just because of their desire to really grow in holiness and righteousness, and really hear what the Word of God has to say. And so, yeah, we've seen tremendous growth, exponential growth in a lot of ways.
People that come to your church because of the way you worship, it's not going to matter to them so much if the minister leaves, or some fine point of doctrine. Calvin put worship ahead of doctrine and the necessity of reforming the church. He was on to something. It's half of it anyway. I love to tell people when they join our church, when we're interviewing them, I'll say, if you like the way we worship now, that's good, because we don't have any plans to change in any dramatic way. We're not going to pull the rug out from under you, which is what happens in a lot of churches. Everything changes every 6 months, and we want to be churches not like that. Zoe, tell us about the church plant up there in Idaho, and how that's going, because I hear it's going pretty well. This is not the prosperity gospel. This is just an encouragement to people that the ordinary means of grace, biblical church ministry, it often works.
Yes, well, we don't have any pre-COVID statistics to draw from, so you can only take everything that we report to you with a grain of salt. But I'm echoing things that have been said by Tim and Matt, but a lot of the people who've been coming to our church that weren't part of the initial core group have started coming even from Pentecostal and Baptist backgrounds, just completely out of the blue, because they realize that our worship is reverent and the Bible is preeminent. So it's just solid preaching and teaching. One of the members of our core group recently said to somebody, I think it was my husband's dad, he said, "I have not looked forward to worshiping on a Lord's Day more than I do today." And my husband would tell you, he says, "I'm not doing anything special. I'm not doing anything remarkable or different." But for some reason, people seem to be really responding positively to it. There was a family who has been visiting. They're not necessarily on board with the whole Presbyterian project yet, so we're not pushing them too hard, but they met a couple that was part of the initial core group at a mega church Christmas program, and that couple invited them to church, and they've been coming for the last like 6 or 7 weeks, and they are just amazed that we actually have a service that's ordered, and we say parts of the confession during the service, and we actually read almost an entire chapter of scripture every morning, and the fact that we have an evening service is huge. So my husband was saying to me the other day, he was like, you know what? It kind of bothers me that here I am. I'm just really the dollar store version of the pastor that mentored him when he was becoming a minister. He says, I'm the dollar store version of my mentor, and all I am doing is having 2 services on Sunday. It's exactly the same as most PCA churches. It's very simple. I'm not doing anything special. And for some reason, people don't seem to understand that that's all you need. So really quite simple. We're kind of astounded at the growth the Lord has been giving to us. This last Sunday, we started out with a core group about 50 people, give or take. And these were all people who desired to see a PCA church in North Idaho. So there was interest before we came. It wasn't like a parachute plant or anything. So there was interest from the core group. And so they came, got started in November. Our services would be averaging about 50 on a Sunday morning and maybe about 15 on a Sunday evening. I'm going to brag on my husband for a second. He will preach. He has preached to 7 people on a Sunday evening before. It's not glamorous, but he says he's prepared to preach if it's just me sitting there. So I really appreciate his tenacity.
You need it.
Yes, I do. I need it more than anybody who's coming to church. Just trust me on that. But and so it grew from like 50 in November, and then we started getting into the 60s and 70s in January, and sort of hitting the 80s in February. And this last Lord's Day, we had 122 people at our church plant, excluding in-lab children. So, which there are a lot of. So we average about like maybe 135. So it was really encouraging to see that. We have brand new visitors every week, practically. A couple from the local mega church. We're not exactly sure how they found us, but we hope they come back. So yeah, just the fact that worship is reverent and biblically focused, and it's not a dog and pony show. Something that surprised me when I moved to North Idaho is the fact that North Idaho is very churched. Practically everybody goes to church around here, but it's very shallowly churched. So I think I can predictably say that the people who are coming realize that there is actually another way to do church. It's not, the same version of everything else that's going on. So it's really encouraging to see. I don't know what the prediction for the future is, but we are pretty much crammed into our tiny church building, which is a former PCUSA church that was sold to a community center, by the way. We just rent it on Sundays. So it's kind of like a subtle, point of pride that I feel worshiping on a Lord's Day.
What town?
It's Post Falls, Idaho. Seth and I live in Coeur d'Alene, which is impossible to spell and say, which is okay. But the church meets in Post Falls, Idaho. So, yeah. So I've been rambling on, but that is just a little bit of a report from North Idaho. The potatoes are getting evangelized. There's a veritable revival out here. So.
Well, I tell people it's never been easier to stand out. If you do simple Reformed worship, they will come because it's never been more different from everything else in the church world. It just has not, and it's different from some. It's even different from high church Anglicanism, which I don't know if they're growing as quickly as some of these ordinary means of grace churches, but of course they're different too, and they're capitalizing on that. But we got good news here. We have challenges, and some of our challenges are like those from before. We didn't talk about it a lot, but I would say don't be afraid to raise the red flag. Don't be negative all the time, but don't be afraid to say, in the past that led to this, and this led to that. And it doesn't have to be that you're coming from a place of fear. You can be resolute. You can be watchful, and you can love the church in that way. So, Dr. Hart, as we wrap up, any concluding thoughts? Anything you want to add about the viability of our ordinary means of grace churches, or maybe we're just wrong about everything?
Well, you're not wrong about everything, but I mean, I'm still. Oh, geez. The cat just jumped down. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we haven't seen the cat.
She
You're
got
good.
caught up in my wires. I mean, say what you will about Aaron Wrenn, and I like a lot of what he does. The whole negative world thing continues to play out the way people use it, and I think there's something to it. I think it's encouraging to hear this about churches elsewhere in Hillsdale. The it's fairly saturated. We have no mega church. We're not big enough for a mega church. There are some new church plants that have come in that are trying to be mega church light, and I don't know how well they're doing, but there's a very strong LCMS church, very strong ACNA communion. There's a former Peace USA, now EPC congregation, a big Baptist church, a big Methodist church, a big Pentecostal church or Assemblies of God. So we're not experiencing growth like that. We do attract students, and I think for students who come to the college and want a solid ministry of the word, they come and they participate for a while. Not all of them stay, for different reasons perhaps, but it's not as if I want to go to some sort of cultural Christianity, but there was a time, I mean, I think, Brad, you can testify to this, that the boomers may have known a world where the larger society didn't make it hard to be a Christian. Now, maybe it wasn't, Reformed Christianity, it wasn't authentic in some ways, but going to church, being part of a local congregation, identifying with Christ in some way was much more acceptable. And I think that has really changed in the last 10 years. And so I do wonder how that's going to play out, but maybe this is a Michigan Northern sort of perspective. No one else here. I don't know what Zoe would think of Idaho. It's obviously west or northwest, but when it comes to north and south, I don't know where it fits in that schema. But I do think it could be difficult for churches going ahead, and I'm haunted too by. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going over to Christendom. I'm not going over to Doug Wilson, but once Constantine converted, and to Constantine's credit, we have the Nicene Creed because of that. Christianity had a kind of presence in the Roman world, and then eventually Europe and beyond, that I don't think Christianity would have had without that help of the empire. That's not an endorsement of that, but we have come to a time when I don't think churches can depend on that kind of reinforcement from cultural or political authorities. And so in that sense, it's much more of a return to the early church. And it could be tough going, especially for you younger people who outlive us older people.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, the economic, I've predicted there's going to be a lot more bivocational pastors in 10, 20 years than there are now for various reasons. We could easily have a huge economic downturn at some point. There could be warfare in the world that affects our economy and our country in different ways than we've been used to. All those things will be stressors for the church, but it's what's right, and the way you ought to order a church now will be the way you ought to order a church then.
Right.
That's the beauty of being Presbyterian. You've long said that institutions are very helpful, that the magistrates helped along the Reformation. It wouldn't have happened without it. I would hope that many of our solid church members get involved in government, business, culture, all those things. But I think it all still starts with the local church, and that's what we're emphasizing here tonight. So I think we'll wrap it up with that. Thanks to everyone. Anyone's got anything they want to say very quickly, you're welcome to do so. But it's been.
I did forget to mention one of our congregations in our presbytery over doubled in size over that 3-year period. It went from 9 to 19.
There you go.
So
that's math.
yeah,
That's good.
Great congregation, Marion, North Carolina. If anybody's close to the mountains.
Huh. Well,
I will also add that we don't give infants communion at our Reformed Church in Idaho. Just
you
quick
might
plug.
you might be the only one in the Northwest that doesn't do that, but hats off to you. All right. Well, let's we've covered a number of things, but I think it's been generally encouraging. And who knows what we're going to have from General Assembly and about the General Assemblies that are coming up. It's going to be some long days for me, so there may not be maybe one live show, maybe two. And I might give Zoe the keys to the Presbycast Twitter account because I don't really think I'll have time to deal with it. She's just learning that, but she needs to think about whether she's up to that task. But in the meantime, we'll thank everyone for listening. Stay tuned for our General Assembly season plans. And of course, Resby would want me to tell you, if he were here, don't be an Erdman.
What's wrong with you people?